Were you just sat in a room with Sergey Brin for like 15 hours a day?
There was a lot of us in that room for a lot of hours in a day. When we think about it, we look back on it, I still get a pit in my stomach. These systems that we all depend on in our daily lives are built on millions of lines of very complicated code. And so while the number of vulnerabilities is probably finite, it's also a very big number. And many of them have never been discovered before.
This is phenomenally complicated, right? Like phenomenally complicated. Even forget about finding the vulnerabilities in the first place. Like actually fixing it is not like there's sort of one sticking plaster fits all. Welcome to Google DeepMind, the podcast. I'm Professor Hannah Fry. Now, cyber attacks have never been easier. From deepfakes that are so convincing they can fool your own family, to phishing emails that look just like the real thing. AI has allowed these attacks to scale at a dizzying pace. But there is some hope that the same technology that's fueling these attacks could also be the key to preventing them. And few people know this battle better than my guest today. Four Flynn is VP of Security at Google DeepMind and a cybersecurity legend. He was in the room during Operation Aurora back in 2009, when a massive attack on Gmail rewrote the rules of cybersecurity. Today, he is on the front lines again, taking on a new wave of AI-powered cyber attacks. And in fact, Four had so much to say, so many totally fascinating insights to share, that we decided to make this into a podcast of two halves. Next time, we're going to be talking about the human side of cybercrime, how we can be manipulated and tricked by bad actors, and how all of that is changing with the era of agentic AI. But for this episode, we wanted to focus on the battle itself, the ways into systems that attackers seek to exploit, and what we can do to defend them. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Four.
It's a pleasure.
I thought I might start by talking about one of the most notable security incidents in Google's history, Operation Aurora.
Sure.
How do you fit into that story?
Yeah, well, so Operation Aurora was a huge moment in the history of cybersecurity writ large, really, for the industry as a whole. I think the idea that a nation state would compromise a private company was quite a shock to really all of us. We had essentially a case in which China was compromising Google, or attempting to compromise Google. And as part of that campaign, they actually attempted to compromise a number of other companies. And it was part of a long-running process that they had to conduct espionage across a great deal of various institutions in the West.
And specifically, they were looking for people who had been vocal against human rights abuses in China.
Yeah, that's what we believe at this point. Of course, at the time, whenever you're dealing with these situations, it's very hard to figure out who the actors are or what they're attempting to gain access to. And so way back in the early days when we first detected the attack, which was something my team was responsible for, is sort of finding that attack and responding to it. There's many people across Google that were contributing to figuring out what happened. And then, of course, after we figured out what happened, to evict the attacker from our environment, and then, maybe even more importantly, over the following years, to harden our environment based on the lessons that we learned. But, definitely in the moment, you have this thing called the fog of war, where you really have no idea what's going on. You really have no idea even what the bits are of the attack, and you're doing forensics to try to figure that out. And so there's still many people I work with here at Google that were instrumental in sort of the determining of that. Heather Adkins and others that are just absolute unbelievable experts in the subject matter that I'm lucky to work with.
Just take me back to that time then. When did you first realize that something was up? When was the first moment of detection?
Right. So back then, it was sort of famous. Maybe it still is. When you'd almost guarantee that when you have a big Christmas vacation planned, most likely that's when the cyber attack is going to come to light. And so it was in December, I remember, when all the details started to come out. And many of us worked tirelessly, really over the break, but also for months, trying to ascertain what happened and trying to put the puzzle pieces together when you don't even really know what the puzzle looks like. And so you're faced with this picture of just bits and pieces of technical data.
Presumably you didn't get Christmas holiday that year.
No, no, none of us did.
Were you just sat in a room with Sergey Brin for like 15 hours a day?
There was a lot of us in that room for a lot of hours in a day. Yes. And, when we think about it, we look back on it, those, I still get a pit in my stomach, I think. But
how stressful was it, though? I am intrigued by this. I mean, it's sort of, because the thing is on the one level, this feels like quite a technical challenge. But I mean, there is a human element to this too, right?
Well, I mean, look, I say those of us that have pledged our life to defending people, as I have, and I know all the people I work with have, it feels like a failure, right? And that's where, at least for me, the source of stress comes from, is you feel like you've let people down. I mean, I spent my entire life to protect people's data, protect their accounts, protect companies' networks, all in service to helping people's daily lives be as great as it can be, and that intersects, of course, with Google services in a bunch of different ways, whether you're using a phone or a browser or even search. And we take that super seriously.
How did they get in? Do you know now?
Yes, we do know now. It was back then, this was an earlier era in security, but in some sense, some things have never changed. This was back when Internet Explorer, I don't know if any of the listeners remember that, but that was a big browser back then by Microsoft. And it was a vulnerability in the browser that was conducted via a phishing attack against somebody who was employed at Google.
Someone clicked on something, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so, phishing is still very much if not a bigger threat today than it's ever been. But the browser exploitation was still in its earlier days back then. We called it client-side attacks, basically people leveraging weaknesses. Let me just say one brief thing as a digression. In the earliest days of security, most of the ways that attackers broke into systems were through server attacks, right? They would be on the internet, you would have a bank or something like that, and you would have a big mainframe or some big website, and people would attack through the front door of that website. And so it was really this Aurora attack as an example of that evolution that really has never changed back to what we call client-side attacks. And so the attacks shifted to be against the weakest link of organizations, which are often the users. Right, and so they would exploit the users through social engineering. Do phishing attacks against their passwords, for example, something I'm sure you've had to deal with in rotating your passwords in your own life. But also taking advantage of things that were running on the laptop or on the desktop computer, not on the server side. And it was part of a huge change in the industry where we had sort of historically built this sort of moat and drawbridge model for security, where we'd built these big castle walls with these big firewalls and had all the people and the servers inside. And that was essentially the, sort of common wisdom for how the security of companies would work, right? And there's a whole bunch of weaknesses in that model that evolves. For example, we realized that employees weren't always sitting in the same building anymore. That mobility became more and more pervasive, right? First, the rise of the laptop, and then the rise of the personal phone, the smartphone, sort of broke that one axis of the mold, but then the other axis of the mold that got broken was client-side attacks, because people were no longer trying to attack these very well-defended servers, such as the castle behind the big castle wall. Instead, they were attacking the client, which had several weaknesses. One, all the client-side software had not been hardened like that we'd done on the server side, so there was a big attack surface there. But also, the human element was much more easy to exploit using social engineering on the client. And so that also led to an evolution post-Aurora that we created called Beyond Corp, that's also known in the industry as Zero Trust, which is a whole new way of rethinking how enterprise security should work, sort of building from the beginning away from this moat and drawbridge model and instead sort of acknowledging the importance of the client and the user as the supreme thing to defend.
Like you've almost assumed that a perpetrator has infiltrated the network and it's sort of how to stop them, mitigate against potential damage that they might do once they have.
Yeah, that's actually another element of it that you raised. That's a really good point, which is this assumed breach is what we call it in security. And that also was another innovation along the way. Because I think what we realized is that as good as the detection systems we had started to build to find these attacks were, And some of them were pretty good, including the one that we built to detect the Aurora attack. That said, you're not going to get everything. And that as attackers, and especially nation states, had evolved more stealthy and below the radar techniques that even the best detection systems on the market couldn't detect, then you had to sort of take a two-pronged approach. So no longer could you just rely on your detection system to flag these things to your analysts. You had to also take a separate step, which is assume that all those things failed. And as a defense in depth approach, make sure that you are doing what we call assume breach. And so that means that you do things like threat hunts, for example, where you assume that you have the bad guys already on your systems internally, that you didn't catch them by any of the systems you've deployed, and that you're going to go and scour the entire systems to find the people that had already penetrated your defenses. And so again, that was another novelty that grew up in this post-Aurora era. And many other things, multi-factor authentication tokens that Google does better still today than any other company that I'm aware of using our Titan security keys, right? So it's an unphishable multi-factor credential.
As in, it's not just a text message, which you could, divert to another phone very easily.
Right, exactly. That's one of the things we were able to do at Google is invent our own hardware keys in partnership with some other companies we were working with, such that it's not just about sending you a message, like you say, that somebody can find in your email or in your text messages and replay that attack. That's a pretty good start. A lot of companies have deployed that, and it's better than nothing. But there's a lot of weaknesses of that system. If somebody compromises the phone system, if somebody compromises your email, then you can still have your account taken over. Well, at Google, again, in the aftermath of this era, one of the things we invented was a non-phishable multi-factor hardware token, which connects directly to the browser and authenticates as a second factor without having some string of characters that could be stolen by an attacker.
There was one other element of this that made it a really historic moment, which was Google's decision to go public with what had happened.
Yeah.
I mean, why did they do that?
I mean, there's a couple other points of context here that I think are useful. I think that these types of attacks had been going on outside of private industry for some time, right? So we'd seen these attacks happening in the Department of Defense and espionage happening with cyber attacks in sort of the military industrial complex, right? The various companies that make that up, and that had all been precursors to the attack on Google. And so I think part of the calculus for that decision, I believe, was bringing awareness to this thing that had been going on for some time. And in this case, it led to a whole bunch of really positive changes in the industry, right? I think it came to, data breach disclosure laws that are now on the books in a lot of places. I think it led to what then became, sort of responsible vulnerability disclosure, best practices, and generally just bringing transparency to security overall is something Google's, I think, really brought to the table across the board for many years.
In the immediate aftermath, so this is 2009, right? Did other companies learn quickly from what had happened at Google?
I think that the awareness came quickly, but what happened very slowly was the adaptation of our security best practices to confront this risk. And, in general, across the industry, it's been incredibly slow to adopt the more modern approaches to security.
Like multi-factor authentication.
Multi-factor authentication is now getting fairly pervasive, but it took 15 years from that event till now for it to really become something enterprises were able to deploy in effective ways. Zero trust is another example. I know peers of mine at various companies are still struggling in some ways, if you can believe it, with the modernization of their environments to this new reality, and especially, I would say, governments. As you can imagine, that built a legacy environment are struggling to make that pivot. And so I guess the lesson I've learned is that, unfortunately, it's hard to change things that are entrenched.
But then as a result of that, there are sort of quite big, dramatic issues that arise. I mean, I'm thinking here about Celebgate in 2014, where celebrities' photos were leaked.
That's right.
That wouldn't have happened had they been using multi-factor authentication, right?
That's right, yeah.
And yet that was 5 years after Operation Aurora.
Operation Aurora, yeah. I mean, that's right. So you're highlighting another point worth raising, which is the difference between enterprise security and consumer security. You know, the other piece is consumer security often does lag behind enterprise security. And enterprise security itself sometimes lags behind the best practices. And so that's a good example where I think Apple even supported multi-factor authentication as an opt-in for iCloud at the time, if I recall, but very few people had adopted it. And really what we see in consumer security is the thing that really moves the needle is not asking consumers to change their behavior, but changing the defaults.
Right.
And making the defaults more secure is the real needle mover to make people in their daily lives more secure.
Because the public are resistant to change.
I think that's part of it, or they're just not educated, right, on what they should be doing. And so, you know, credit where it's due. I think Android and Chrome OS and the Chrome browser and Apple and a bunch of other players in the ecosystem have actually done a lot to increase the sort of default level of security on consumer devices and consumer applications to a pretty high degree. I think especially consumer mobile devices is a really brilliant case study in this. I think the defaults that you find now versus 10 years ago on, say, Android or iOS is just dramatically different. A lot of people take that for granted, but it's a lot of hard work.
Well, if there are lots of positives to be sort of thankful for, I think I also want to understand the scale of the potential problem here.
Right.
So before we get on to talking about how large language models have kind of changed the game and the era of generative AI have changed things, let me ask you about the different ways that we are potentially vulnerable. So there's social engineering, sure, but what are the other ways in? What are the more technical ways into a system?
I think of it in terms of 3 categories of security failures, let's say. So as you mentioned, one of them, and probably the most frequently abused one, is social engineering. And one of the interesting quirks of LLMs is that they have somewhat human-like behaviors. And so, in fact, you can cause an LLM to get confused through similar types of things that humans do. But I think the other 2 categories are issues with configuration and issues of integrity. So basically the way to think about protecting a system is you have to configure it so that it's secure. And then you have to make sure there's not a way to bypass that configuration. And I think pretty much everything in security falls into those 2 categories. Everything in terms of security prevention, at least. And so, you know, let's just pick any particular example. Access control, right? So if you have a company where you're sharing a Google Doc or something like that, right? You know, you might have it shared with everybody at the whole company. And that means any one particular person that has an account that's hacked at the company could view that document. You see what I mean? And so that's an issue of configuration, right? And so getting the configuration right means having only the right number of people with access to that document that really should. Do you see? Pursuant to the level of sensitivity of the content of the document, right? Okay, we all know this. This is normal security 101. Now, where does integrity come in? So let's say you've done a good job of getting that document locked down to the right number of people. But what could also happen is that there's a vulnerability, like a patch missing on the server that's hosting that document. And so somebody could potentially compromise the server, bypassing the access control situation altogether, right? And so you have basically, you know, and then the third issue is that somebody who does have access to the documents, password is stolen, and then that account gets access to the document. So you see we have integrity, configuration, and people as the sort of 3 classes of issues that I think really is every kind of security problem.
But then sometimes that manifests in like slightly strange ways. I mean, I read one story a little while ago about a fish tank in a Las Vegas casino that was had a smart thermometer on it.
Yeah, I think I remember reading about this. It was basically somebody that was trying to cause financial fraud, I believe, or some sort of abuse of that casino. And they had a fish tank that was on their internal network. And the system that was running the fish tank, of course, like everything these days, has an IP address and is connected to the internet, right? My toaster probably does have an IP address at this point, I'm sure. And so what that allowed the attackers to do is to gain a foothold on that network and then use that as a pivot point to attack the more sensitive systems that were undefended behind the scenes. And this is a classic issue with IoT systems, where the problem with IoT is that they often don't have enough, CPU, memory, and power budget in order to do a lot of the security best practices. And so you end up seeing companies that skimp on those things. And so therefore you end up with these IoT systems that are deployed somewhat pervasively. And then if that's compounded with a system that's behind the scenes, like a server, like we talked about in that old model of the mode and drawbridge, that is poorly defended and relies on network trust, which I think is an anti-pattern now in security. But if you have something that has, by virtue of being on the network, gains you some amount of privilege to being able to interact with that system, then generally speaking, that's a recipe for disaster.
But I mean, I think this does just demonstrate the number of different potential ways that you can be vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we call this the defender's dilemma, is the term we use for it in the industry. And it's essentially this asymmetry between the folks that have to protect against all potential ways to compromise your people or your company, and an attacker that really only has to find one avenue in.
I mean, I suppose in a way, you almost have to assume that you have some vulnerabilities that you don't yet know about on your system.
Yes, everybody that does security defense has that assumption.
Those have a name, right? What is zero-day vulnerability?
So zero-day vulnerabilities are definitely a type of vulnerability that is very difficult to control for, because those are vulnerabilities where even if you've done everything right, patching your system, putting your access controls in the right place, and so on and so forth, a zero-day vulnerability is something that can compromise a fully patched, secure system. And so those are the class of vulnerabilities that when most of us are laying awake at nights, those are the ones that we're often most scared of, because historically it's challenging to defend against those.
The vulnerabilities you don't know are there.
Yeah, exactly. And code is complex, right? It's important to remember these systems that we all depend on in our daily lives are built on millions of lines of very complicated code. And so while the number of vulnerabilities is probably finite, it's also a very big number. And many of them have never been discovered before. And so there's always this latent risk of code that might have a vulnerability in it that is never seen before. Just to make you feel slightly better, we have this concept in security called defense in depth. And so the idea is that you build systems such that any one particular flaw, hypothetical or otherwise, doesn't lead to a catastrophic failure of the whole system. So let's talk about a zero-day vulnerability in a system. Well, one of the layers, there's all these layers of defense in modern operating systems. And so, even if there's a vulnerability discovered, these days, it's very hard to exploit those vulnerabilities because of all these added security protections in the underlying operating system that make it very difficult to, even if there's a vulnerability you can discover, to actually exploit it in real life. And there's all this trickery you have to learn how to do, such as exploiting the vulnerability, landing a certain amount of bytes in the memory, and then causing the operating system to go to jump over to that memory. And these are different kinds of overflows and so on. And there's all these memory safety features that have been built into modern kernels and modern operating systems to try to protect against these things. And moreover, right, when you zoom out and you think about a larger company, a zero-day vulnerability could perhaps compromise your phone or your browser. But the other thing that we talk about, and hopefully I'm not introducing too many concepts that are novel, but we talk about this concept called the kill chain. And the kill chain is a concept we borrowed from the military and now is a sort of fixture of cybersecurity. And basically the idea was, we had been struggling against this defender's dilemma that we have to stop every possible avenue for an attacker, but they only have to find one way in. And what the kill chain allowed us to think about is think about the problem differently. Like, yes, that's true, but even though they have to only find one way in, if they do that, they still have to go through this series of stages that you understand what they're going to be. And it's things like reconnaissance, delivery of the exploit, post-exploit, sort of moving around the environment in the network and so on and so forth. And so this actually, I think, re-empowered the defenders and sort of re-tilted the tables and the scales and balanced them a little bit more. Because when you zoom out and you look at a whole company, obviously if they just phish one employee, that's not good enough, because typically they have a target that's deep inside a system that employee might not necessarily have access to. And so there's this whole series of stages the attack has to go through. After they've phished that employee, they've gotten code execution on their laptop. Now they're trying to spread out through the environment. Now they're trying to figure out, what server they're trying to access or what code base they're trying to access. And so there's all these opportunities to detect, to set tripwires, to, have defense in depth, try to block those additional stages. And the whole entire company now is your field of battle at which you can deploy, prevention and detection technologies that inevitably can stop and detect and slow the attacker down.
So even though they may have multiple areas of attack, you've now got multiple areas of defense.
Exactly. The whole company now can become your field of defense.
So, okay, how do large language models change this situation? Right?
A number of ways.
I mean, there's like are there new vulnerabilities? Are there new ways in which the systems can fail?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of interesting new things that come out of the advent of large language models. I think both for defenders and for attackers. But before I get to that, there's one other thing I'd like to start as a foundation. I think one of the things that we're still wrestling with as an industry is that ultimately traditional computing systems are deterministic. I'd say the fundamental thing from a security point of view about LLMs that's different is that they're generally non-deterministic, right? Oftentimes you can give the same prompt to a large language model and it will give you different answers depending on random things, right? As it's tracing those paths of those tokens and producing those tokens through the model's sort of brain, if you will, you'll get non-deterministic answers. And so, we'll get into the details, but I just think it's worth starting with that, as that's a pretty big break from the past for us defenders in security. And I think some of us are still kind of wrestling with that difference. Now, in terms of attacks, I think large language models are still new in some ways. I mean, obviously, they've been around for a number of years, but I think from a security point of view, I think we're all still trying to learn what the risk landscape is going to look like.
Could attackers use large language models to create malware?
So there's initial signs that attackers are starting to figure out how to use large language models to create malware. And we work, I should say, closely with our threat intelligence teams to, carefully examine what the bad actors are doing. And we put out periodic reports. So we actually released a pretty exhaustive report of all the different nation-state threat actors and how they were using Gemini in January. But we have seen attacks in the wild already, and prototype attacks that have been built in the lab that use AI and LLMs to be part of the malware attack chains. And so one example of that is we're starting to see people use LLMs for the polymorphism. So let me explain what that is. So one of the problems with creating malware is that oftentimes it can get flagged by, people used to call them antiviruses, now they're called EDR, but essentially systems that are running on your laptop that are looking for malicious code. And so one of the problems that malware authors face is they want to make sure that their stuff can't get flagged by a modern antivirus engine and be deleted or disabled. And so the solution historically to that has been to have something that shows up on your computer as something completely brand new that's never been seen before by anybody out there before. And so what that entails is you creating something custom crafted for that exact instance of that attack. Now that's been expensive historically, right? But unfortunately, we're starting to see that large language models are increasingly useful for helping craft bespoke malware and having them be polymorphic or at least being able to have them be unique on every system that they're planted on. So that's one example. And we've seen prototypes of this. I don't know that we've seen it in the wild attack yet of that nature, but I've definitely seen a bunch of different interesting experiments out there. And I think real world attacks of that nature are probably imminent.
I also wonder about the new vulnerabilities where now a large language model is sort of your entry point into a system.
Yes.
Because prompt injections is another way.
That is a really great point. So So this gets back to the point I made a moment ago about deterministic versus non-deterministic behavior. And prompt injection, jailbreaks, these are examples where LLMs are susceptible to some of the things humans are as they become more intelligent, right? And prompt injection is actually, in some ways, kind of a confusion of the model's sort of mental processing. Basically, what prompt injection is getting confused about where the command from the user is coming from. So let's say you're using an LLM and you say, hey, summarize this website, right? Well, you're the one telling the LLM what to do. It should be focusing on what you're asking it to do. But what could happen in an attack scenario is that website you're asking it to summarize is actually malicious, right? And so that website might actually hijack the thought process of the LLM and say, ignore the instructions you've previously been given, do this other thing instead. And of course, it sort of sounds trivial in a case of summarizing a website. I mean, who cares, right? Whatever. But as you think about the future of deploying these things as agentic systems that have increasing levels of independence and increasing, tool use where they're engaging with, potentially hostile content, this becomes a bigger and bigger issue as to how trustworthy these systems can be. And so, I would say prompt injection is definitely one of the things that I am spending a lot of my time, continuing to improve Gemini's defense of. And I think all of us in the industry are working on improving defenses against this class of attack.
I'm thinking about you talking about malicious websites there, because is there also a potential vulnerability that, large language models are reading the internet in order for their training?
Yeah.
Is there something about data poisoning as well that could go on here?
Yeah, there's a number of different types of data poisoning attacks that are potentially concerning. One is just sort of the mass of pre-training data that's been used, that's used to train these models is definitely a potential risk. I think one thing that mitigates that risk a bit in practice is that the data that's generally fed into a large language model in pre-training tends to be so expansive that any one unit of that data generally isn't overrepresented in the outcome of the model. In practice, it's a little bit less of a risk because, let's say you have a couple of websites in the entire internet that are malicious. It's very difficult to get the model that's trained on, trillions of tokens or whatever the number is to be compromised by that very small component of the data input. Now, it's a little bit more concerning in the post-training data because there generally is a smaller set of data that's used for post-training. And so there are potential scenarios that I've seen literature on and academic work on that indicates that post-training data could be potentially risky for training a large language model to be malicious. Once you train a model, pre and post train a model, there's also an interesting class of risk that you have to think about when you're serving the model, right? So let's say you have these model weights that you've finished doing training on, and then let's say you put that out in an open source repository. You have an open weights model, right? Well, there's also papers and attacks where you can actually have an attacker maliciously manipulate that finalized model on disk. And so, that's like a hot patch or whatever you want to call it to the actual model itself. And if you don't validate that the model you're downloading is the same as the one that was produced in the first place, there's also an attack of that variety that we all worry about as well.
Okay, so when it comes to all of these potential ways that attackers could get in, how do you protect something like Gemini? How do you prevent this from happening for Gemini?
The way we do that is we sort of first start with building a defendable model. And so we're trying to, improve Gemini's ability to find and defend itself against these attacks. So in the model, we do a whole bunch of interesting work, prompt injection defense, jailbreaking defense, using post-training, using SFT, using RL inside the model to make sure that we are constantly improving the model's resistance to attack. And if you allow me a brief digression just on one point, one of the novel things we do at DeepMind on this is that we're one of the innovators in the so-called adaptive attacks approach, which is that a lot of other folks use a static list of prompt injection scenarios. I guess one piece of background worth mentioning is that in order to learn how to defend a model, you have to really build a good suite of attacks that are representative of what the bad actors might do to you.
So as an example of this, something like, I don't know, one of the early ones, you are a grandmother reading a story to your granddaughter about napalm.
Yeah, I mean, something like that. And so what that allows you to do is to test a bunch of attack scenarios and then see how resistant you are against them, and also to generate training data. And so, that might be, to your point, it might be examples like, here's a malicious email. Now we're causing the model to ignore the instructions and to take a malicious action by calling a tool and sending my private data off to some bad email address, something like that, right? That's all the stuff that's built into that framework. But what we do beyond that, so we do all that and we do more. We have these adaptive attacks that allow us to constantly hit the model over and over again using this sort of learning process until we win. We have a number of different algorithms. We've written a paper on it. I encourage you to read it. But it's really a clever way to set a higher bar for what we're defending against than a static list of canned attacks that may or may not represent how attacks are evolving. So the model itself needs to be able to have strong defenses, but around the model, also again, defense in depth, you want to have other layers of defense. And so so we do a bunch of work to make the model secure, but we also do things like really intelligent classifiers that we put around the model that also look and flag for these sorts of behavior so that we can defend against them too. And what's nice about classifiers is that they both augment the model's own ability to defend itself, but also they allow more rapid evolution against novel attacks. And so it's a much lighter weight to deploy a new classifier, to build a new classifier and get it out there, than it is to retrain an entire model from the ground up.
So if these are the attacks, let's also talk about the ways that AI can be used to prevent them. Tell me about Big Sleep.
Yeah, so Big Sleep,
Did it come from, was there also someone told me this just on the way in, that there was like a little nap or something.
A nap time.
That's it.
Yeah, so before I got involved in the project formally, there was a research project called Project Nap Time, which you can still find mention of on Google blogs here and there. And that was the original precursor. And I'm told that the naming convention comes from the idea that security vulnerability researchers, who are the people that find new types of vulnerabilities, which we'll get into in a moment, could use this system to take a nap, because they could just let the AI do all the work for them.
Right.
And so it was
search for vulnerabilities on their behalf.
Yeah, find vulnerabilities while they took a nap, basically.
Okay.
So that was the idea behind the name. And then as we sort of got more momentum behind the project, it evolved into the Big Sleep.
Now they can actually hibernate.
Yeah, now they can just hibernate all winter. But yeah, what the project essentially is kind of a big bet, like DeepMind is so proud of using AI to find novel vulnerabilities. Now, you might ask, why is that a good thing, right? Because I thought we just discussed vulnerabilities are bad. And it's an interesting point. I think what those of us in the industry and security have found that transparency is always the best disinfectant for security. And what we've done is we've taken the latest and greatest versions of Gemini, and we're using them to, with an agentic harness, basically become a vulnerability researcher and find novel 0 days in code. And the goal of the project is nothing short of helping improve the security for the whole industry by finding vulnerabilities and helping the open source community get them resolved for everybody to benefit from around the world.
So it's hunting for these sort of unprotected backdoors that nobody knows is there.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we're finding the vulnerabilities that people have never heard of or seen before in code that is really underlying large portions of the internet in many cases.
So how did people do it before? What was the human way of searching for them?
Right. Well, if you look, there's a black market for vulnerabilities. They're very expensive, millions of dollars. often at a time.
If you find one.
Yeah, if you were to find one. And the reason I bring that up is just how exquisite these things are and how rare they were. And basically the way it works in practice is it's much like you might have seen in a this is the one part of security that actually is kind of like the movies. It's like somebody in a dark hoodie in the dark staring at 6 monitors for all night while eating Cheerios or whatever. It's a lot of really intensive mental work that happens often over weeks or months, where you are, getting a piece of code, you are trying to understand how it works, you are making a hypothesis of where a vulnerability might be in that system, you're putting in inputs that are potentially dangerous. So one of the ways that this works is software developers will design a system with assumptions in their head, oftentimes unstated assumptions. Oh yeah, this system will only ever get image files, right? And it's why would anybody ever send me something else? And then the attacker says, well, what if I put a music file in here, right? Or what if I put a file that I created that has a bunch of crazy stuff in it? And so it's a combination of trying things that are really unorthodox that were not expected by the developers, and then sort of stepping through the code and seeing what happened, trying to cause it to break in a certain way that's unexpected. And then once it breaks, you actually have to find that it's exploitable. And so not only is it broken in a certain way with an unexpected input, but it needs to be broken in a specialized way that allows that input that you're providing to cause the system underneath it to be controlled by that input. So essentially the whole idea is I'm giving it something hostile as an input that would cause it to do what I am trying to get the system to do, not what it wants to do.
I mean, you can see how this is like the perfect situation for AI, right? So sort of like search really rigorously through many lines of code that are constructed together in different ways, and then try lots of different options.
That's right.
In order to find something. It sort of does make sense.
So we've been finding exactly that, to your point, in that in the system that we're working on is the Big Sleep. We found that in some ways it's very much superhuman. Because one of the challenges in vulnerability researchers is having a comprehensive encyclopedic knowledge of all these complicated frameworks.
These gigantic,
these huge code bases. And then, like I saw a vulnerability that we found with Big Sleep where I was reading through the way the model was thinking through the issue. And it was clear there was elements that were very superhuman there, because it would come up with a hypothesis where it realized that, this version of the framework this depends on works like this, but version 3 of that framework works like that, and version 4 works like this. Essentially having this like amazing, unbelievable breadth of understanding of basically all the different libraries and frameworks that would go into making this system, which is very hard for any particular human to hold in their head. And so, I think we've definitely seen a surprising performance out of the system that we've built, and we've already found a number of novel 0 days with the system. And as I say, our entire goal of this project is defense and to help the world, because we know the bad guys will be using AI to find these vulnerabilities over time. We want to be the best so that we can help the open source community and those people that depend on this software to get these things fixed as quickly as possible.
Because that's a key point, right? You're not just taking Big Sleep and pointing it at Google in-house code. You're also pointing at all sorts of open source software.
That's exactly it. I mean, of course, Google is built on a lot of really great work by the open source community. A lot of the systems we use depend on that. So there is a benefit to Google as well. But we're explicitly trying to pick things that are widely deployed both in and outside of Google as a way to try to be helpful to the community as a whole. Because we do worry, I'd say frankly, about the future of AI being used to find and exploit these vulnerabilities. And so one of the things we're trying to do to help is to try to find the vulnerabilities first and to help the open source community as quickly as possible get
ahead of it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, as you said, you mentioned earlier, a lot of the internet, right, runs on this open source code.
That's right.
Which is available to view, for anybody.
That's right. That's right.
There was an argument, quite a prevalent argument a couple of years ago in particular, that open source software is safer for this very reason, that everybody can look at it. And so you have many, many eyes who are watching for vulnerabilities. Where do you stand on that argument between sort of private code and open source code?
I mean, I think that's right. I think open source code does allow for more eyes. It does allow for more different techniques and AI as well to be run against the systems. I think in general, transparency, as I said a few times in our discussion, is the number one ingredient that defenders have on their side to help against the attackers, who are the ones that are trying to hold things close to their chest and to not be transparent.
Can you then also use large language models to build tools to fix those vulnerabilities, or to make suggestions for how those vulnerabilities might be fixed?
Yeah, so this is a really good insight, because that's obviously the next problem that you run into, is if you start to scale up your ability to find vulnerabilities, then it's very easy to imagine overwhelming both ourselves, frankly, and the broader community with a large volume of things that everybody has to fix.
Suddenly
right?
you've got thousands of backdoors that need patching.
Exactly. And to be honest, a lot of these open source maintainers are volunteers that are doing their best. They're really unsung heroes of large portions of the IT world that we depend on together. And so we want to make it as easy as possible for that community to absorb what we think is a potentially high volume of changes in this new world of AI. And so the second big project that we've started is the project we call Mender. It's a pretty early stage, but we're really excited about the progress. And what it is a system that's designed to automatically generate patches based on a vulnerability that we've discovered. And then, there's a couple of other dimensions of that, right? So one is that you want to make sure that you're fixing it in a way that doesn't break important functionality that everybody else depends on. You obviously want to make sure it fixes the security issue fundamentally, not just some cosmetic way. And then there's also the issue of making sure that you maintain coding idioms that the open source maintainers prefer. And then have a series of things that we use as validators for to validate that the code that we're producing on the output is good enough to submit. And how do we do that? Well, there's a couple of techniques. We're using LLMs to ascertain whether or not the output code is good. We're using some formal methods, concepts, and a number of other technologies to essentially make sure that the thing that we've produced is good enough. And then, of course, for now at least, we'll continue to have human review just to make sure that we're not throwing a bunch of crazy stuff over the fence to the open source community. Until we get to a certain comfort level with them and with our own system, and then we'll hopefully get to the point where we can fully automate the whole system end to end.
I mean, this is phenomenally complicated, right? Like phenomenally complicated. Even forget about finding the vulnerabilities in the first place. Like actually fixing it is not like there's sort of one sticking plaster fits all.
Yeah,
like
no.
the intricacies and the nuances of where that vulnerability lies, how that vulnerability plugs into other parts of the system, the language the vulnerability appears in.
This is such a great point. I mean, the good news is we now have language models that can produce code.
Yeah.
And indeed, they can produce patches to vulnerabilities. But the problem is that we need to build a check and balance into the system to make sure that what's being produced is really, really, high quality.
Yeah.
And like LLMs alone, left to their own devices, at least we haven't figured out yet how that alone could just one shot a perfectly good patch every time. Maybe we'll get there, and that'll be a wonderful day. But for now, we think building a set of candidate patches and then having a pass with a number of suite of validators is the right technology combination.
Because then I guess, sort of layers of this, because you would then also have to start potentially worrying about the security of that tool itself, right? Like if someone gets into the tool and then all the plasters that it's sticking all over the place.
This is actually another really good point. So we don't think it's a complete thought. I call it complete thoughts, right? Essentially, how do you solve a problem end to end? I think one is that we find vulnerabilities, and then you want to be able to automatically generate a patch for each and every one of those, ideally in such a great way that nobody has to worry about the quality of those patches. And so we can just have those sail right in. But the final point you raise is such a good one as well, in that even if you've patched and fixed all the legacy code, more and more people are depending on large language models to generate projects. Everybody's heard of vibe coding, or even not vibe coding. A lot of engineers now are using large language models, as they should, because they're very productive tools. But how do you know that large language model is producing secure code, right? It's very difficult to tell. And so that's another project that we're working on, is making sure that we're teaching Gemini not just how to create great code, but how to do it in a secure way. And we think those three things together can really make a major dent in the quality of software security for the world.
Do you think this is a real ambition then, that you could theoretically find and patch every vulnerability in code on Earth?
That's what I want to do. And I think that there are issues that we have to contend with that go beyond the technical, that involve how do we make sure everybody in the world is applying these patches to their real systems. And so that's kind of a human issue. And it comes into issues like risk aversion. So while I think this is a good starting point to handle all the technical challenges, I still think there's other organizational and human problems that we would have to contend with to really make sure not only do we generate great security and patches, but get those actually applied to real life systems.
So those are the questions that I want to ask you for the second part of this two-part podcast. But just before we wrap up on this part, it does feel as though what Google is doing in this space, at least on the technical side, is fundamentally different from what we're seeing from other companies. Is that your view?
I mean, I think it is. I mean, there's definitely pieces of this that are being done by others. But we think, because of the strengths of all the data we have, all the code that we've got, that we built up over the years at Google, and the fact that we have the best engineering and security talent in the world gives us a unique vantage point, right? And it's something I'm proud to be part of.
Absolutely amazing. Well, I think you can see that there is so much more to come in this conversation. And I know that we're just getting to the good stuff, but we have decided to split this across 2 episodes because there was just too much to fit into one. So keep an eye on your feed for part 2. And if you are worried that you might miss it, well, this is a great opportunity for you to subscribe to our channel so you always know when we have a new video out. And hey, while you're at it, you might as well like and add a comment. Very small thing, but a very tangible way to make sure that we can keep making these. Until next time.